Me, myself. British Isles, Scotland. Off the western coast of Scotland is a group of islands called the Hebrides, or Western Islands. One of the largest is Islay, and near it is a smaller island, Orsay. For many years Orsay was used only for grazing cattle. These belonged to a laird or landowner on Islay, and were ferried across by boat a few head at a time. The crossing was mild enough when the weather was clear and the sea was calm. Sailors knew to be careful of the fearful tides around the island, and only a foolhardy soul would attempt crossing the Sound in bad weather. Old stories said that Orsay was sometimes visited by kelpies, or water horses. These might emerge from the sea in the shape of horses, or in the form of hairy, clumsy-looking men. People said they could hear the kelpies wailing loudly near the island just before storms. But the grass on the island was sweet and thick, and the laird wouldn't let old stories keep him from fattening his herds. When all the cattle had been sent across, he hired a young man, Duncan McPhee, and his new wife, Fiona, to tend his cattle. The two were very much in love, and needed only each other's company to be happy, so they got along quite well on the lonely island. Duncan was a big, powerful man with a handsome, weathered face dotted with freckles. Fiona was tall and fair-haired, with flashing blue eyes. At night, when the cattle were safe in the byre or cowshed, they would close the shutters of the one-room stone cottage the laird had built them. Then they would sit by the peat fire that burned on the hearthstone in the middle of the dirt floor, talking softly, while the wind howled outside the thick stone walls and rattled the roof slates. One afternoon, while they strolled along the rocky beach, Duncan was delighted to discover 4 large eider-duck eggs. Fiona was far more excited when she found a handful of fairy eggs nestled among the seaweed and shells. These hard, light nuts, something like flat chestnuts, were gray, black, and brown. "Ah, what are you going to do with them sea nuts?" asked Duncan. "I'll string them on a bit of ribbon," said Fiona, "to wear round me neck. My granny says they keep off the evil eye and other wickedness, and cure sick cattle too." "Sure they're not keeping the kelpies away," said her husband, pointing out to sea. "Oh!" cried Fiona, clutching the fairy eggs to her chest. As she looked out across the water, a brown head and a gray head bobbed amid the waves. 2 pair of soft, curious eyes met hers. "Shame on ye, Duncan McPhee, for giving me such a turn," she said. "Them's nothing but 2 seals, wondering what we're about." "Ah, so they are. My mistake," he said, laughing and taking her arm. "Tease me so again," she said, with just the hint of a smile, "and you'll not think it near as funny." At that moment a fulmar gave a shrill, lonely cry, and Fiona turned anxiously to look at the sea. But even the seals had gone. There was only the empty expanse of bright blue water. "Tomorrow I must row across to Portnahaven for supplies," said Duncan as they climbed the steep path. "Must you?" she asked. "I feel a storm coming on." "There's precious few oats and barley left," he said, "and many other things we need besides. The weather will be fine, you'll see." Sure enough, the next day was mild, with calm and hazy sunshine over sea and land. Fiona rose early to cook barley bannocks. She wrapped the flat cakes of bread in some linen for Duncan to take with him. Standing on the bluff, she watched him rowing across the sound. Even as she gazed, she felt a wind rising, churning up waves. The little boat pitched and tossed, but Duncan was a skillful sailor, and he rowed on without mishap. When she could no longer make out the rowboat, the young woman checked on the cattle to be sure none was grazing too close to the cliff edge. Then she returned to the cottage to feed the chickens and tend her little plot of turnips and potatoes. She kept busy, trying not to think of the changing weather. But when she stood up from digging in the garden, a strong, chill wind billowed her skirt and apron. Looking toward the Sound and the mainland beyond, she saw a heavy mist upon the dark blue sea. In a short time this gave way to a wind-driven rain. She prayed that Duncan wouldn't be so foolish as to try to cross to Orsay in such foul weather. When the cattle were secure in the byre, and the chickens in the hen-coop, Fiona retreated to the cottage. She drew the shutters tight and prepared to sit out the storm with a bowl of porridge and a cup of tea. But while she was stirring the oatmeal with a spurtle, a wooden stick about a foot long, Fiona suddenly heard the sound of living creatures moving all around the house. "Duncan?" she cried, thinking for a moment that her husband had returned and brought some other men with him. But the wail of the wind reminded her that the storm was too strong for Duncan to cross the Sound. "Sure no, it's the cows are out of their byre," she exclaimed. She hurried to the nearest window and threw open the shutters. To her amazement, she found herself gazing into a pair of large, round, blazing red eyes that fastened on her own. The sight chilled her to the bone. Gathering her wits, she pulled the shutters closed with a bang that set the dishes rattling on the shelf. In answer, she heard a low, whining laugh. Too late. Fiona realized she hadn't barred the door. She reached up to drop the bar, but the door burst open. In walked an unearthly creature. He was very tall and large and covered with rough hair everywhere except his face. This was covered with a dark bluish skin that looked like fish scales. His long fingers were tipped with bone-white claws. He lumbered to the fire and stared at Fiona, who stood just across from him. Between them the porridge bubbled on the hearthstone. "What is your name?" he asked in the old language that Fiona had learned from her gran. She answered the creature as confidently as she could. "Misha Mifin," which means me, myself. Suddenly the monster reached for her, but the brave young woman grabbed up the pot of boiling porridge with her apron and dashed it over him. Yelling, the creature bounded through the door and into the rain beyond. Fiona heard a great babble of wild, growling voices asking in the old language what was wrong with their companion and who had hurt him. "Misha Mifin! Misha Mifin!" she kept screeching. "Me, myself! Me, myself!" At this, there arose a great shout of laughter. The rough voices taunted, "If you hurt yourself, then you must heal yourself." Again there was brutish laughter. At this the girl rushed out and hid in the byre. She lay sheltered by one of the cattle that had its back to the entrance. She touched her string of fairy eggs, hoping they might keep her safe. Then she drew a circle around herself in the dust and prayed an Our Father in a whisper. For a long time she lay shivering, hidden by the cow. Outside the storm raged, and she heard the comings and goings of heavy footsteps. Several times she thought that one or more of the creatures had entered the cowshed, but she dared not peep around to see. She lay, scarcely breathing. As the storm grew wilder, the sounds outside turned to loud laughter, then fighting, as though the creatures had started a brawl among themselves. Fiona prayed that they would forget all about her. Gradually, the sounds of wind and rain and wild screeching began to fade. By the time that the first gray light of morning showed through chinks in the byre's rough stone wall, all was silent outside. Making the sign of the cross, Fiona rose from her hiding place. She discovered that though the consecrated circle had kept her safe, the cow that had protected her was dead. Its back bore the marks of many claws. The sea was calm and bright under the rising sun. Looking across the sound, she saw Duncan's rowboat on course for the island. Her garden had been trampled by countless brutish feet, ripping up her turnips and potatoes. Half-eaten remains were scattered all around. Inside, the spilled porridge was the only sign of the night's adventure. Shuddering, she drew on a shawl and hurried down to meet Duncan. Though they were always on guard after this, and kept the shutters and door tightly barred after sunset, they were never again bothered by the kelpies.